You will think she's weak because she doesn't speak. But silence, her silence, is not submission. It is alchemy. It is the stillness before the transformation. Most women are taught that their value lies in expression, in the ability to explain, to fix, to soothe, to be understood. They are told that silence is absence, that quiet means invisibility. But a woman who learns the art of silence does not disappear, she becomes unfathomable. Her quiet becomes a mirror so deep that any man who looks into it must face himself. Carl Jung once said that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. A woman who has mastered silence knows this. She does not rush to defend herself against projection, nor does she scramble to correct misunderstanding. Instead, she lets the projection fall. She watches as others reveal their shadows and their attempts to define her. For she knows that the moment she speaks to explain herself, she accepts their illusion as truth. There is a magnetic power in restraint. It is not the silence of fear, nor the quiet of suppression, but the silence of awareness, the silence that watches, that discerns, that waits until words can serve transformation, not reaction. When a woman holds her silence consciously, she does not lose her voice, she guards its sacredness. Jung called this the integration of the anima, the inner feminine, where emotion is not chaos but wisdom in still form. In this stillness, she learns to hear the whisper beneath noise, her intuition. It speaks not in urgency but in knowing. Most people speak to fill the void, she listens to expand it. And in that expansion, she becomes a vessel through which clarity emerges. There is something profoundly unsettling about a woman who refuses to engage in the ordinary rituals of explanation. In a world addicted to noise, she becomes the embodiment of mystery. Men, used to power through speech, find their authority dissolves in her quiet gaze. Other women may project onto her, calling her cold, detached, or arrogant, unable to understand that her silence is not distance but depth. The woman who knows when to stay silent has walked through the fire of misunderstanding before. She has been misread, blamed, silenced in ways that wounded her spirit. But those wounds taught her discernment. They taught her that not every question deserves an answer, not every attack requires defense, and not every presence deserves access. Silence became her boundary, drawn not in anger but in mastery. Jung's concept of individuation, the process of becoming one's truest self, requires this very silence. Because individuation happens in solitude, not in conversation. It is the descent into the unconscious, the still chamber where the ego can no longer disguise itself behind performance. To become whole, one must first become silent enough to hear the whispers of what was repressed, neglected, or forgotten. When a woman stops explaining herself, she is no longer performing for the world's validation. She begins to see herself through the eyes of her own soul, not through the distortions of others' desires. And that shift, subtle, invisible, changes everything. Her energy turns inward, not to hide, but to refine. Her silence becomes a magnetic field that draws only what vibrates in resonance with her truth. It is in silence that she recognizes the shadow's voice, the bitter residue of old wounds that once compelled her to over-explain, to beg to be understood, to speak from pain rather than power. And when she meets that shadow with compassion instead of shame, something extraordinary happens. Her words, when they return, are no longer reactive. They are creative. They build rather than defend. Imagine her now, sitting in a room filled with noise, voices arguing, opinions clashing, energies colliding, and she simply breathes. Her stillness is not withdrawal, it is command. The silence around her bends to her rhythm. This is the essence of feminine magnetism, not in seduction, but in sovereignty. A silent woman is not empty. She is full of awareness, of restraint, of choice. And from that fullness, her presence becomes more powerful than any argument. Those who seek to provoke her find themselves lost, because she gives them nothing to push against. In her silence, their projections crumble, the need for validation devours itself. This is the paradox Jung hinted at. When you no longer need to speak to prove who you are, your very being becomes the proof. Silence becomes expression. Stillness becomes power. And power, held without aggression, transforms everything it touches. Because the woman who knows when to stay silent has learned one of life's greatest truths: words may shape perception, but silence reveals essence. There is a moment, a sacred, almost invisible moment, when silence stops being a defense mechanism and becomes a form of mastery. Most people never reach it. They confuse silence with powerlessness, mistaking withdrawal for weakness. But true silence, the kind born from awareness, is not the absence of power, it is power refined into its purest form. In Jungian terms, this is the passage from the reactive ego to the awakened self. The ego wants to argue, to prove, to be seen. It trembles in the face of misjudgment. It seeks control through explanation. But the self does not argue, it observes. The self knows that truth, once embodied, no longer needs to be spoken. It radiates. It commands not through words, but through vibration. When a woman enters this stage of consciousness, she no longer feels the frantic need to fill the air with her reasoning. Her silence no longer hides pain, it holds power. She has met her shadow, and in doing so, she has made peace with the parts of herself that once begged to be understood. The shadow that whispered, "Explain yourself or they'll abandon you." The shadow that feared, "If they misunderstand you, you will disappear." But now, she understands that misunderstanding cannot touch truth. That her worth does not fluctuate with perception. That her voice is not diminished by her quiet. And so she practices the sacred art of restraint, not to please, but to preserve. A woman's silence terrifies those who depend on her noise to feel important. It exposes the fragility of false authority. Men who are ungrounded in their own identity feel small before it, because her stillness becomes a mirror in which their insecurities echo. Friends who crave validation may resent it, for her quiet reminds them of the noise they cannot silence within themselves. Yet she does not silence herself to punish them. She silences herself to stay aligned with something higher, her own soul. For Jung understood that individuation demands withdrawal from collective noise, from the constant chatter of others' opinions. To individuate is to separate, to listen inwardly, to walk into the forest of the unconscious and let its whispers reorder you. In that inner forest, silence becomes both compass and teacher. It shows her what her words used to hide. It reveals how often she spoke not from truth, but from fear, the fear of being disliked, the fear of losing connection, the fear of being unseen. But when she sits long enough with that fear, she realizes that it is not her enemy. It is her initiation. The feminine silence that emerges after such an initiation is unlike anything the world has seen before. It is not submissive. It is not reactive. It is sovereign. It moves with the gravity of the moon, drawing tides without touching the water. Her energy no longer reaches outward to be validated, it draws inward, forming a sanctuary of self-trust. She begins to recognize the subtle difference between choosing silence and being silenced. One is imprisonment, the other is liberation. The first comes from fear, the second, from clarity. And clarity, once possessed, makes her presence almost unbearable to those who thrive on confusion. This is where the magnetic quality of silence truly begins. Because magnetism does not come from performance, it comes from coherence. A woman who is internally aligned no longer leaks energy through over-explanation, justification, or emotional reaction. She becomes a field of calm power, and that calm is magnetic. Men feel it before they understand it. They sense a depth they cannot manipulate, a stillness they cannot disturb. Her silence calls forth the mature masculine, the man who is not threatened by depth but drawn to it. And for those still ruled by their own unintegrated shadows, her quiet becomes unbearable, because it reflects their chaos too clearly. There is something ancient in her composure. The echoes of the oracle, the priestess, the wise woman. Archetypes that once guided civilizations, now reborn in the modern psyche of women reclaiming their spiritual sovereignty. These are not women who silence themselves out of submission. They silence themselves because they no longer need to shout over the noise of the world to hear the voice of the divine within. Jung would call this a movement toward the self, the union of conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, expression and restraint. The woman who knows when to stay silent has become a bridge between the seen and unseen. Her presence disrupts illusions, not by fighting them, but by revealing their emptiness through her stillness. And when she finally chooses to speak, her words carry the weight of silence behind them. They land differently. They pierce through confusion and awaken something ancient in others, the remembrance that truth does not shout, it resonates. For silence is not emptiness. It is the womb of wisdom, the cradle of creation, the space from which all authentic speech is born. There is a rhythm to silence, a pulse that beats beneath words, beneath even thought. Once a woman learns to feel it, she no longer rushes toward sound for safety. She begins to realize that silence is not the absence of connection, it is the essence of it. In Jung's view, the feminine unconscious, symbolized by the moon, the water, the dark soil of the psyche, does not reveal itself through noise. It reveals itself through stillness. The woman who embodies this truth carries within her a sacred tension, the calm surface of the lake and the unfathomable depth beneath. She becomes both the question and the answer, both the observer and the mystery observed. Silence, when inhabited consciously, transforms a woman from reactive to radiant. She no longer reacts to the world's stimuli like a leaf blown by the wind. She stands rooted, watching the movement of others without losing her ground. She speaks only when her words have been purified by stillness, when her speech arises not from defense, but from direction. To the unawakened, her silence feels unbearable. They interpret it as judgment or disinterest because they cannot yet sit in their own emptiness. They are accustomed to filling every pause with chatter, every space with justification. But she has come to understand something profound. Silence reveals more about people than their words ever could. And how they respond to quiet, their essence is unveiled. A man's reaction to a woman's silence tells her everything. The insecure one grows louder, seeking control through volume. The ego-driven one interprets it as rejection, scrambling to reclaim validation. But the man grounded in his own being does not resist her silence, he mirrors it. He meets it with presence, and in that mutual stillness, something sacred is born. Connection without performance. Communion without noise. This is what Jung meant by the union of opposites, the conjunction, the alchemical marriage of masculine and feminine energies. Her silence becomes a container into which his awareness can pour. Together, they create not chaos, but balance. In this way, silence is not merely personal, it is relational. It purifies interaction, stripping away the superficial until only essence remains. Yet before a woman reaches this depth, she must first wrestle with her inner noise, the voices that clamor for approval, the inherited guilt for taking up space through stillness. She must confront the ancestral programming that told her, be pleasing, be gentle, be heard, be nice. She must descend into that internal chamber where she once mistook talking for power, and she must sit with the discomfort of no longer explaining. This descent is a psychological death. The ego resists it, because silence forces it to face what lies beneath, the old wounds of not being seen, the buried grief of not being believed, the deep ache of having her truth dismissed. But only by walking through that inner wilderness can she reclaim the authority of her voice. Silence is the crucible in which her identity burns away, leaving only essence. And essence is magnetic. People often mistake magnetism for seduction, but it is not about allure, it is about coherence. A woman who is no longer fragmented by overexpression carries a vibration of wholeness. Her silence gathers her energy inward, condensing it into power. When she enters a room, the air shifts, not because she demands attention, but because she no longer leaks it. There is something almost mystical in her presence. She becomes like the high priestess of the tarot, sitting between black and white pillars, veiled, containing both light and shadow. She holds the wisdom of paradox. That power can be soft, that truth can be quiet, that silence can speak louder than any voice. And in this awareness, she discovers the paradoxical law of attraction. What is chased flees, but what stands still draws everything toward it. Her silence becomes gravity, an invisible pull that draws to her only what resonates with her stillness. No performance, no persuasion, no pleading. Just being. Her silence begins to educate her emotions. She learns that she does not need to react to every impulse. That not every misunderstanding requires her intervention. That clarity grows stronger when not forced. This restraint does not suppress her emotion, it sanctifies it. The storms within her find rhythm, her heart learns patience, and her power becomes deliberate. In time, she understands the ancient truth that silence is not the opposite of speech, it is its foundation. Only those who have mastered quiet can speak with authority. For their words do not come from the mind's restlessness, but from the soul's knowing. And so, she no longer fears silence in herself or in others. She can sit in a conversation where words fade and not feel the need to rescue the moment. She can endure the weight of unspoken tension without collapsing into anxiety. She can walk away without explanation, because peace no longer requires permission. Her silence has become her signature. A declaration of sovereignty. A language the world has forgotten how to understand, but one that every awakened soul instinctively recognizes. There comes a point when silence is no longer something she practices, it becomes who she is. It seeps into the way she moves, the way she looks at the world, the way she breathes. It becomes her energy signature, calm, deliberate, untouchable. She has crossed the threshold from reaction to reflection, from the surface of emotion to the ocean of consciousness beneath it. In this state, she is no longer governed by the world's rhythm. The external noise that once dictated her mood now feels distant, irrelevant. She watches people chase validation, argue for recognition, cling to false certainty, and she no longer feels the pull to join them. Not out of arrogance, but out of awakening. Because once you've touched the quiet within, the world's chaos loses its power to define you. Carl Jung described this transformation as the emergence of the self, the totality that holds both light and shadow without denial. Silence is the bridge to that self. It is the moment when the ego stops fighting for control and begins to serve something deeper. A woman who lives from this center no longer needs to explain herself to be understood, she becomes self-explanatory. The magnetism that radiates from such a woman cannot be imitated. It is not in her beauty, her charm, or her words, it is in her energy. She moves through life with an invisible gravity that draws respect without demanding it. People feel safer around her, yet also more exposed. For her silence acts like a mirror, reflecting truth without judgment. It invites others to confront themselves. When she listens, people find themselves speaking more honestly. When she speaks, her words cut through confusion like light through fog. There is no performance left in her, only presence. And that presence is rare, because it can only emerge after the ego has died 1,000 small deaths. This is the alchemy of silence. The woman who once silenced herself out of fear has reclaimed silence as an instrument of power. The woman who once felt invisible has become luminous. The one who used to explain her worth now simply embodies it. Yet this transformation does not happen without solitude. Jung wrote that loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that are important to you. For a time, she must walk alone. Her silence alienates those who are still addicted to noise. Her stillness unnerves those who mistake it for distance. But as she learns to hold her solitude without fear, it turns into sanctuary. In solitude, her intuition sharpens. She begins to sense energies beyond words, the emotional undercurrents in a room, the unspoken motives behind someone's tone, the truth behind a smile. Silence tunes her into the frequency of essence, where everything false becomes faint and everything real becomes radiant. And as she deepens in this awareness, she realizes that silence is not withdrawal, it is expansion. The quieter she becomes, the more vast she feels inside. The boundaries of self begin to dissolve. She feels connected to something ancient, eternal, the same force that moves the tides, opens flowers, and spins galaxies. She recognizes that her silence is not hers alone. It is the silence of the divine feminine, reawakening after centuries of suppression. From this place, her actions become deliberate, almost ritualistic. She speaks less, but when she does, her words carry the energy of truth. She chooses presence over persuasion. Detachment over drama. Observation over reaction. Her very being becomes an act of rebellion in a world obsessed with noise. Others may not understand her, but they feel her. Some will be drawn to her peace, others will be repelled by it. Yet she no longer adjusts her volume for anyone. For she knows that peace maintained through performance is not peace at all, it is imprisonment. Her silence teaches her discernment. She begins to see who seeks to understand her and who merely seeks to use her. The difference is always revealed in the quiet. True connection respects silence, false attachment fears it. When someone can sit with her without needing to fill the air, she recognizes them as kindred. When they cannot, she knows she must walk alone. And so, she learns the ultimate paradox: silence is not the end of communication, it is its highest form. It is where the soul speaks directly, without interference from words. It is where love ceases to be expressed and simply is. Her silence is not cold, it is sacred. Not passive, it is powerful. It is the still point where her inner masculine and feminine energies dance in harmony, the protector and the creator, the warrior and the mystic, the one who acts and the one who receives. In her silence, she no longer resists life. She allows it. She flows, knowing that what is meant for her will find its way, drawn not by force, but by resonance. Because the truth is this: the universe moves toward stillness, not noise. The stars are born in silence. The soul heals in silence. And the woman who knows when to stay silent does not lose her voice, she becomes the voice of something greater. There is a sacred serenity in the woman who has entered this depth of being. She no longer chases meaning, she embodies it. The silence that once felt like exile now feels like home, a living temple within her own consciousness. And in that temple, she has met every fragment of herself: the fearful child, the wounded lover, the angry protector, the wise observer. All of them have been invited to sit at her table, to be seen without judgment. Jung called this the integration of the shadow, when the exiled parts of the psyche are no longer denied but embraced. This is the work of true transformation. And silence is its sacred ground. For it is only in the quiet that those hidden voices can be heard. Only in the stillness that they can rise from the depths and be healed by awareness. Most people will never reach this level of silence because it requires courage, to stop performing, to stop seeking approval, to stop numbing the discomfort of being unseen. But she has faced that terror. She has felt the ache of no longer being understood by the world she once tried to please. And in that ache, she found liberation. Because to lose the world's understanding is to gain your soul's companionship. Now her silence carries the weight of self-trust. It is not avoidance, it is alignment. She no longer rushes to speak because she no longer fears what happens in the space between words. That space has become her power. When she pauses, she lets the world come to her. When she stays quiet, life reveals itself. What used to feel like emptiness now feels like invitation. In her presence, even chaos begins to slow down. Arguments dissolve into reflection. The energy in the room softens, as though her stillness whispers to everything frantic, "Be still, and know." She does not demand peace, she radiates it. And because energy precedes form, everything around her begins to mirror that calm. Her silence is not absence, it is containment. It holds her energy close, like a chalice that refuses to spill. This containment makes her irresistible, not in the superficial sense of attraction, but in the profound sense of gravity. People feel themselves pulled toward her, though they cannot explain why. They sense depth, safety, and mystery. And it is this combination that awakens both awe and fear. For those still lost in their own noise, her silence feels like confrontation. It forces them to hear their inner voices, the ones they've drowned in distraction. Her stillness exposes what they've been running from. This is why the feminine silence has always been feared throughout history, because it reveals truth without violence. It disarms illusion without lifting a finger. Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But becoming who you truly are requires the courage to be misunderstood in the process. The woman who knows when to stay silent has accepted that risk. She no longer fights to be seen through the distorted lenses of others. She no longer trades her truth for belonging. She has realized that the soul's approval is the only one that matters. And the soul speaks not in applause, but in quiet knowing. Her relationships transform as well. The ones built on performance fade away, for silence does not sustain pretension. But those built on presence deepen. She begins to attract people who can meet her in that stillness, who do not need to consume her energy, but can coexist within it. With them, silence is not awkward, it is sacred. Words become offerings, not weapons. Conversation becomes communion, not competition. And in this shared quiet, love evolves. It is no longer the frantic grasping for validation, the constant need to be reassured. It becomes spacious, tender, sovereign. She understands now that true intimacy does not require constant words, it requires constant awareness. That love is not about merging into noise, but about harmonizing in stillness. When she does choose to speak, her voice carries the frequency of truth. Her words are few, but they move worlds. They do not seek agreement, they transmit reality. Her speech is not reactive but prophetic, it reveals rather than convinces. For she knows that to explain truth to those not ready to hear it is to waste divine breath. Silence, in those moments, is compassion. And yet, beneath this serenity, there is still fire. Silence has not extinguished her passion, it has purified it. Her desires no longer scream for fulfillment, they hum with intention. She acts not out of impulse, but from alignment. This is the true marriage of the feminine and masculine within her, the receptive and the active working as one. She has become what Jung might call the individuated woman, whole within herself, undivided, unshaken. No longer looking outward for validation, she turns inward for guidance. And from that inner place, she moves with certainty, even when the path is unclear. For silence has taught her to trust the unseen. The more she trusts it, the more life flows through her effortlessly. Opportunities appear, connections form, clarity unfolds, all without her forcing anything. This is the magnetism born of silence, not the chase, but the pull, not the demand, but the alignment. She finally understands that silence was never emptiness. It was the echo of her own soul calling her home. And now, standing in that home, she realizes she does not need to be heard to exist. She does not need to be chosen to be worthy. Because a woman who knows her worth does not speak to convince. She speaks to bless. And when silence is her foundation, even her quiet becomes divine. The journey has not made her quieter, it has made her eternal. The woman who understands the magnetic power of silence no longer chases validation. She moves from knowing. She attracts from being. The woman who understands her value does not chase, she chooses.